June 22, 1941. 11,000 Soviet T-26 tanks sat silent, once the Red Army's pride. In 6 months of slaughter, 10,000 would vanish in flames, explosions, and abandonment. Young crews trapped in burning wreckage, entire divisions erased within weeks. How did the world's largest armored force collapse so catastrophically? On the early morning of June 22, 1941, something terrible was about to happen. Operation Barbarossa, the German attack, was starting to hit the Soviet Union hard. All across the western part of the Soviet Union, thousands of Soviet T-26 tanks sat quietly in their military bases. These machines used to be the best tanks the Soviet Army had. But very soon, they would become symbols of one of the worst military disasters ever seen in history. The story of the T-26 tank begins back in the late 1920s. The Soviet Union bought several Vickers 6-ton tanks from the United Kingdom. Soviet engineers looked at these British tanks and decided to make them better. They changed things and improved the design. This is how the T-26 light tank was born. The T-26 had a 45mm main gun and was built really strong. When it started being used in 1931, people thought it was one of the most advanced tanks in the world. By 1941, the Soviet Union had built over 11 T-26 tanks. This made it the tank they had the most of in their Red Army. These tanks had fought well before. They did great during the Spanish Civil War and the Winter War with Finland. People said they were reliable tanks that could fight really well. But even though there were so many of them, and they had won battles before, they were about to face something that would be too much for them to handle. When the Germans invaded, they caught the Soviet military at a really bad time. The Soviets were trying to change things around. Many of the T-26 tanks were not taken care of properly. The people who were supposed to fix them didn't have the right parts they needed. Even worse, many of the tank crews didn't know how to drive or fight with their tanks very well. The officers in charge had never led big tank battles before. All of these problems would make things really bad in the first few months of what the Soviets called the Great Patriotic War. As the German forces moved east into Soviet territory, everyone could see the big problems with the T-26 tanks. The armor on these tanks was too thin. Back in the 1930s, this armor was good enough to stop most weapons. But now, the German 37mm and 50mm anti-tank guns could punch right through it. The T-26 used gasoline for its engine, which caught fire really easily. The tracks on the bottom were too narrow and got stuck in the muddy Russian countryside. The German Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks were much better. They had thicker armor and better ways for the crew to talk to each other. Time after time, the German tanks would outfight and destroy groups of T-26 tanks. The numbers tell us a really sad story. In just the first 6 months after the Germans invaded, the Soviet Union lost about 10,000 T-26 tanks. Some got blown up in battles. Others broke down and had to be left behind because no one could fix them. Many were just abandoned when the Soviet Army had to retreat really fast. Whole tank divisions just disappeared within weeks of when the invasion started. The cost in human lives was just as terrible. The tank crews were mostly young men who didn't have much experience. When their tanks got hit, they had to make a horrible choice. They could try to escape through the small hatches while people were shooting at them. Or they could stay inside their burning tanks. Veterans who lived through this would later tell stories about the awful things they saw. Long lines of T-26 tanks burning along country roads, with their crews trapped inside. But even though the T-26 disaster was so bad, it actually helped the Soviet Union win the war in the end. The hard lessons they learned in 1941 made them change how they thought about tanks and how they designed them. The T-34 tank came next, and it became one of the most famous tanks of World War II. This new tank was built using all the lessons they learned from what went wrong with the T-26. The Soviets completely changed how they trained tank crews. They also changed their battle plans to make sure tanks, infantry soldiers, and artillery all work together better. Today, only a few T-26 tanks are left. You can see them in museums across Russia and Europe. They stand there quietly, reminding us of both how technology gets better and how tragic war can be. Their story teaches us something very important. Just having more tanks than the enemy doesn't mean you're going to win. Losing these 10,000 tanks in just 6 months wasn't just a military disaster. It was a human tragedy that changed how the Eastern Front of World War II went. The T-26 disaster teaches us lessons that are still important today. It shows us why military preparedness matters, why armies need to adapt to new technology, and reminds us that war always costs human lives. As modern armies keep changing and making new weapons, the basic lessons from 1941 are still true. Proper training, taking care of equipment, and having good battle plans are what really decide who wins military fights. In the end, the story of the T-26 tank disaster is about more than just losing military equipment. It shows us how brutal it is to learn about modern warfare. It honors the courage of the soldiers who fought and died in these tanks. And it shows us how incredibly strong a nation can be when it eventually wins despite such terrible early losses. When 10,000 tanks disappeared in 6 months, it marked the end of one time period in Soviet tank warfare. But it also helped create the military force that would eventually help defeat Nazi Germany.